All right, so before we deep dive into this passage, we're going to be in 2 Samuel 1, 6 through 16 today. I just want to give you like a brief background on where we're at, because we're entering the story right at the middle of like the story. So if we were to look back at 1 Samuel, we see some pretty key things that happen. We see the birth of Samuel, which is really important because it's a miraculous answer to Hannah's prayer. And when Samuel is born, he's devoted to God, and so he's taken to the temple, and where he then becomes a prophet, a priest, and a judge of Israel. And in doing so, he leads Israel into this spiritual renewal and these military conquest victories over big enemies like the Philistines. And then as we enter into chapters 8 through 15 of 1 Samuel, we see this reign of Saul. Saul has the key distinctive to be the first king of Israel, and he's made king because Israel goes out and they demand a king like all the other nations have. And so as they are demanding this, God allows it to happen, and Samuel is moved from this judge position to just this prophet position, and he anoints Saul as the king. And Saul starts out pretty strong. He goes on some conquests and he's listening to the Lord, but then he quickly compromises and he starts to disobey God. He offers these unauthorized sacrifices because he's not willing to wait on the Lord. And then he ultimately fails to obey God's command to destroy the Amalekites. And that brings on his downfall, which results in God rejecting Saul as king. And so Samuel goes and anoints David, a shepherd boy, to be the next king of Israel, though he won't take the throne for many years. And then we see the rise of David in 16 through 31. If you look at 1 Samuel, you see like this X being formed. There's always somebody on the rise and there's always somebody on the decline. And so Saul is on the decline and David is on the rise. And where we come at in the story today is right at the center of that X, where the two paths have finally met. Saul is now dead and David is now on the way to the throne. And so that's just a quick background of where we're at, what we see happening in our story today. And so as we dive into our text, I want you guys to think back to a moment when someone had wronged you, they failed. And in that moment, they might have lost their job, their reputation might have dwindled, or their position of influence was lost. And how did you feel in that moment? Did you feel tempted to cheer, or did you capitalize on their loss? These are the kinds of crossroads that reveal who we really are in life. And so David has, likewise, he's been hunted by like an outlaw for years. He's been falsely accused. He's been slandered, chased across deserts and into caves by this jealous and unstable king. So he has every reason to, it seems like in our eyes, to cheer at the fall of Saul. And so David, he's already been anointed king. He has the right to the throne, but instead of seizing it, he does not take it by force. He doesn't do it through manipulation, but he waits on the Lord. He is honoring Saul's position as the Lord's anointed, even at the cost of suffering to David. And so now Saul is dead, and David is at this moment where he could finally say that the throne has arrived to me. Finally, I've been vindicated. The man who's been a tyrant to me for years, he's now dead, and I can ascend to the throne. And this is where the scene where lots of Hollywood movies would cue the triumphant music, and the hero would ride off into the sunset as he ascends to glory. But instead, David turns to lament and to grief. He tears his clothes, and he weeps, and he fasts, and he grieves. And so this passage isn't just a passage between two kings. It mirrors what reflects a condition of a godly heart in a moment of ultimate testing. And so let's turn to the passage today. Again, it's 2 Samuel chapter 1, and it'll be verses 1 through 16 today. And as I read it, listen not just to what's happening, but to how David responds with his emotions and with his judgment, and then ultimately with his theology of what he's thinking. So starting in verse 1 of chapter 1. After the death of Saul, when David had returned from striking down the Amalekites, David remained 2 days in Ziklag. And on the third day, behold, a man came from Saul's camp, with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. When he came to David, he fell on the ground and paid homage. David said to him, "Where do you come from?" And he said to him, "I have escaped from the camp of Israel." And David said to him, "How did it go? Tell me." And he answered, "The people fled from the battle, and also many of the people have fallen and are dead. And Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead." Then David said to the young man who told him, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" And the young man who told him said, "By chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa. And there was Saul leaning on his spear, and behold, the chariots and the horsemen were closing upon him. And when he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me, and I answered him, 'Here I am.' And he said to me, 'Who are you?' And I answered him, 'I am an Amalekite.' And he said to me, 'Stand beside me and kill me, for anguish has seized me, and yet my life still lingers.' So I stood beside him and killed him, because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the armlet that was on his arm, and I have brought them here to you, to my Lord." Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan, his son, and for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. And David said to the young man who told him, "Where do you come from?" And he answered him, "I am a son of a sojourner, an Amalekite." David said to him, "How is it you were not afraid to put out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" And then David called one of the young men and said, "Go, execute him." And he struck him down so that he died. Then David said to him, "Your blood be on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, 'I have killed the Lord's anointed.'" And so before we look at how David responds to Saul, we need to to Saul's death, we need to understand how he first hears about it, who brings the message, because it seems like a tragic reporting of news at this point in time. And it actually is a test of character for both the messenger and the one receiving it. And so your first blank there would be the report. The report, and that's verses 1 through 10. And so David has just returned to Ziklag after this fierce battle with the Amalekites. He followed through with what God had commanded in 1 Samuel 15. And now he's looking for a moment of rest, but The peace that he is expecting doesn't come, and a man arrives from Saul's camp, and he's covered in these visible signs of grief. The torn clothes and the dirt on the head, these are symbols in that day of grief and sorrow, a lot of times connected to a national tragedy or just a deep personal sorrow. So he's bearing these displays of tragedy and grief, but in this case, it's a hollow act. This man is not an Israelite, he's an Amalekite, a member of the same people group that God commanded to be destroyed back in 1 Samuel 15. And he stands before David, and he's claiming to have partaken in the death of Israel's first king and the death of Saul. And he brings proof. He brings the crown that Saul was wearing, and he brings the armlet that Saul was wearing. These are both unmistakable symbols of royal authority in this time. And so behind the mourning clothes and the dust-covered head, there seems to be a calculated plan that this Amalekite has in his mind. He doesn't come with grief, but he comes with this ambition. And this isn't a good ambition. This is an ambition that is sinful in nature. He sees an opportunity, and in his mind, he sees his ticket to reward, to recognition, and to potentially even a spot in David's court as he takes over Israel. He says, "I've done what you wouldn't," is what he's implying. He's finished the job. He's killed Saul, and now here's your crown. Here's the crown of Israel. And unfortunately, this is a tragic misunderstanding of David's heart, and a fundamental misreading of what it means to honor the Lord. And so I just made a few observations, 3 for this section, for 1 through 10. And so my first observation is that there's deception and contradiction in what this man is saying. So this man, this Amalekite, he directly contradicts what has just happened in 1 Samuel 31. If you're familiar with the passage, you'll know that after being mortally wounded, Saul is left on Mount Gilboa, and he, instead of letting the Philistines take him and torture him, he decides to kill himself. And so that's the report we're getting from 1 Samuel. We know that this is a fabricated story. And so the Amalekite, he likely stumbled upon Saul and came across him when he was already dead, and he grabbed the royal items, the crown, the armlet, and then he, on his way to David, starts fabricating this story to start to boost himself up, make himself look better than he is. And he assumes, maybe correctly, that David, like any other king of the area, would reward him for something like this. If you look at any of those other kings in the area, they would be very happy if you killed their enemy, and they would reward you for it. They might give you a spot on their council, or some land, or just a pretty prize in return. But David doesn't operate in that worldly logic some of the time. And so David's operating from you have lifted your hand against the Lord's anointed. And then secondly, there's motivation and some political gain for the Amalekite. So again, this man isn't driven by grief or by duty to tell David this terrible news, but he's driven by this ambition, this sinful ambition. And he thinks that doing something unthinkable might make him more valuable. And he gambles that David's rise means that Saul's memory can be discarded and kind of trashed a little bit. And so in short, he believes that David is just another political player in the game of power here in Israel. And then thirdly, the symbol of the crown and the armlet. So these are not just war trophies, battlefield trophies that you can collect. They represent the physical transfer of power from king to king. And so the armlet, though he thought he was delivering, he was going to deliver this good news and this glory to David, but David receives them as symbols of tragedy and not of triumph. So David doesn't see the throne as something that can be personally gained, that you can seize. He sees it as a holy trust and something that only God can give, and he can only give it in his way and in his perfect timing. And so this passage exposes the human tendency to seize opportunity at the expense of others, to bend the truth in moments of transition, and to chase influence by doing what is expectant rather than what is right. And so we may not today wear crowns, but we all face moments where we're tempted to make ourselves look good by shading the truth, by exaggerating how our part in something, or presenting ourselves as more helpful than we really were. In the military, there's the rule of 10. So whatever I say, if 10% of it is true, then we're widely accepted as true, at least in the Air Force. I don't know. And so if I was partaking in like an engine change of a jet, if I worked on it for an hour, I get to say that I worked on it the whole time. And so I get to exaggerate what actually happened. And that's exactly what we do as sinful people at nature, is we exaggerate what has happened often. And so the Amalekite, he represents a subtle but yet dangerous impulse to climb and spin and scheme, even if it means stepping on someone else's story, on their pain, or on their legacy as a whole. So in the face of this report, David doesn't respond with opportunity-hungry ambition like the Amalekite had hoped, but instead we see something that stuns us even more. We see this deep and genuine sorrow come from David. What follows isn't a coronation of David coming in and taking the throne, but a lamentation. David's heart breaks before he even thinks of wearing the crown. And that brings us to our second point, the grief. The grief, verses 11 through 12. So David has just received news that Saul and Jonathan are dead. He holds the crown in his hand, which could now rest on his own head, and the path to the throne is at least unobstructed at this point in time. But before he takes a single step forward, David, he stops and he evaluates, and ultimately he breaks down in grief. We see in verse 11, it says, "Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and so did all the men who were with him." This is not a quiet moment in the house of David here. It's a scene of intense and public grief. It's raw and unrestrained. He doesn't strategize, he doesn't scheme, he doesn't celebrate, but he mourns the loss of the king, the loss of his friend, and the loss of Israel. And so he weeps, he fasts, and he laments deeply, not just for his best friend, but for Saul, the man who hunted him and chased him for years. And so David's grief is a threefold grief. And first, it's a personal grief. David had a deep bond with Jonathan, a brotherhood that was formed through covenant, loyalty, and love. Earlier on in 1 Samuel, it says that David and Jonathan's souls were knit together. So losing Jonathan was like losing his own soul, a piece of his own soul. But even Saul's death hits him personally. Saul had been David's king first, so David highly respects that. He had been his father-in-law, which is very significant in our lives. And so he's been a part of David's story. And this, though the relationship was painful and rough, it was not an insignificant relationship, and David recognizes that. So it's a personal grief. Secondly, it's a corporate grief. David doesn't just grieve in isolation. He doesn't run off to a far corner of his house into a dark closet and cry for a few hours, but he leads others in mourning. And as we'll see next time I teach, we'll look at David's lament, but we'll see how he leads the nation in mourning. But in this very moment right here, he leads those who are around him, the men who are with him. They follow his example. And he weeps not only for friends, but for the fallen people of God, for the army of Israel, and for the national tragedy that has just taken place. So this is a moment of shared sorrow, a corporate lament for a nation that is wounded and now leaderless. And then thirdly, it's a spiritual grief. This is not just political loss, it's deeply theological what David is doing here. Saul was the Lord's anointed, and David would never forget that. David would never forget that because he had opportunities to take Saul's life, and he refused to because he saw something sacred in Saul's calling. And now that calling has come to an abrupt and tragic end, for David, this moment reflects something far deeper than just politics or the taking of the throne. It's divine sorrow in David's eyes. The anointed one has fallen. The king of Israel is now dead. And more importantly, the Lord's name has been profaned in battle. And so in an age where we use sorrow to gain attention, or we just skip past sorrow altogether in the name of productivity, David shows us that godly leadership laments before it takes leadership. So before David takes a step, he pumps the brakes and he looks back and he says, that was a big deal. Let's take time to grieve this before we move forward. His tears, they're not a sign of weakness, but of spiritual strength. They show that he understands this moment is not about him. It's about God's people, and it's about God's purpose, and about the brokenness of sin and of death. This kind of grief is a very prophetic kind of grief. It's a grief that says something is not right here. So we need to take a step back and look at it and reflect and grieve. And it's a type of grief that ought to break our hearts in these times. And so if we're being honest with ourselves, when someone who hurt us or wronged us falls, our first instinct is often relief or justification. And we think that we go through these emotions of like, finally, the justice has been served to this person. This person is getting what they deserve, and I'm being vindicated. But David's response challenges us. He doesn't stand over Saul's fall with vindication. He falls beside it in sorrow. But David's grief doesn't leave him passive either. So after mourning, he turns back his attention to the deliverer of this message. And what he says next reveals a fierce reverence for God's authority and a standard for godly leadership that doesn't bend with convenience. And so that brings us to our third point, the confrontation, verses 13 and 14. So after mourning, David now turns his attention back to the Amalekite, and he asks him a pointed question. He says, "Where are you from?" And it's not a question of nationality, it's a question of identification. The man replies, I am the son of a sojourner, an Amalekite. And so in other words, I am not one of your people, though I have been living among you. And in that moment, David responds with a very theological and emotional question. He says, "How is it that you were not afraid to put out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" How is it you were not afraid to put out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? This isn't outrage. This is reverence. David is actually stunned in this moment, not just by the act that this man has done, but by the absence of the fear in him. The man has lifted his hands, whether in action or in claim, against the one whom God had set apart. David can't even in this moment, he can't comprehend how someone could do such a thing in the first place, but do such a thing without trembling or fear before the Lord. David's heart is grounded in a deep, reverent understanding of God's sovereignty and God's anointing. To David, Saul was far more than a man, than a flawed man or a political obstacle. Saul had been chosen by God. He had been set apart by God for a divine purpose. And David had lived for years under Saul's unjust oppression, and yet he refused again and again to take matters into his own hands. He could have killed Saul on 2 different occasions very easily. The first, he could have killed Saul in a cave while Saul was going to the bathroom. The next one, he could have killed Saul in his own camp while he was sleeping, but he wouldn't do it. And then so we're left to ask why. It doesn't make sense to us why he wouldn't capitalize to get the throne a little quicker. But David gives us something we often forget. He believes something that we often forget. And it's that to oppose what God has appointed, even when it is messy, is to oppose God's authority itself. I'll say it again. To oppose what God has appointed, even when it is messy, is to oppose God's authority itself. And so this is why David is so disturbed by what the Amalekite has done. It's not just the action, it's not the heart posture behind it. It's that he had no fear of God, no reverence of divine appointment, and no understanding that to strike Saul down was to lift your hand against heaven itself. And so in our culture, reverence is very rare, it seems like. We live in an age that mocks authority, delights in scandal, and thrives on tearing down leaders at the very moment they falter. But David offers a radically different posture, one that honors God by showing restraint towards even imperfect leaders. This doesn't mean to just blindly follow with allegiance, right? This doesn't mean to overlook sin, but it does mean to recognize the sacredness of God's calling, and refuse to take what only God can give. And perhaps more personally, it means restraining the urge to shortcut God's timing. David had every reason to believe that the throne was his, but he wouldn't reach for it. Even when it was in arm's length, he wouldn't reach out and speed up the process. He waited for God to place it in his hands. And for us to look back on David, that's what true faith really looks like, is waiting on the Lord. That's what true reverence looks like for God, is to not take something, but know that he will give it to you in his perfect timing. And so David's reverence moves from words now in those last few, in 13 and 14, to now action in 15 and 16. What began as a test for David becomes judgment for the Amalekites. And what unfolds next shows us that honoring God's name means upholding justice, even when the world will call it extreme. And so your fourth and final point there is the justice. verses 15 and 16, the justice. So after hearing the Amalekites' story, David issues a simple but chilling command. He says, "Go and execute him. Go execute him." And just like that, the man who thought he had secured a place in David's court is now cut down. And it's not because of treason. It's not for violence. It's not even for the lying that he has done, but for daring to claim, even falsely, that he had lifted his hand against the Lord's anointed. So David's verdict is clear. Your blood be on your own head, for your own mouth has testified against you. In other words, you sealed your own fate. What you have just told me, your story, it sealed the deal. I now know what I must do. And it's important not to take this as revenge, but it is righteousness. This is not David in a fit of rage or political purge where he's cleaning out the courts or anybody that had anything to do with Saul. This is justice rooted in the fear of the Lord. And David is not defending his own reputation here. He's defending God's honor. The issue is not personal offense. It's spiritual violation here. And so the Amalekite may have thought he was winning David's favor, but he completely misunderstood David's view of kingship. David saw the throne as something sacred and something not to be seized. The man's claim to have killed Saul, true or not, was a confession of rebellion against God's authority. And in David's eyes, this could not go unpunished. So this passage, it reveals something uncomfortable but necessary for us to know. It's that sin is not always what we do. It's often what our heart is willing to do, given the chance. Sin is not always what we do. It is often what our heart is willing to do, given the chance. And so the Amalekite may not have actually killed Saul, but he was willing to say that he did. And he believed that killing God's anointed was a pathway to greatness for him. And it's a sobering reminder of how sinful ambition, even in small doses, can twist our integrity. It exposes the truth that God doesn't just weigh our outcomes, but that he weighs our motives, and he looks not just at what we have accomplished, but how we got there and why we wanted to get there in the first place. And so how often are we tempted to justify compromise for the sake of results? To do the right thing the wrong way, or maybe even doing the wrong thing for good, with a good goal in mind. In ministry and in leadership and in family and career, it's easy to excuse ambition, this sinful ambition, as vision. Manipulation as a strategy, or self-promotion as stewardship. But David shows us a better way. Integrity must outweigh opportunity. The crown here, David is saying, the crown isn't worth it if we have to trample over God's values to wear it. This moment of justice isn't about revenge here. It's about righteousness. And it forces us to ask hard questions like, how do we respond to power, opportunity, and grief? Or what do our instincts say about our hearts? And in David's response, we see the shape of a godly leader. But more than that, we see a faint outline of Christ himself. David's response to Saul's death is more than a lesson in restraint here. It's a window into the heart formed by the reverence of God. And in this moment, we see a kind of king, the kind of king that Israel truly needed. Not a man who was obsessed with power or taking the throne, but one who is broken by the weight of the calling. And not a man who would take shortcuts, but one who would wait on God's voice. And in David, we catch just a small glimpse at this point in time of an even greater king. So like David, Jesus would refuse to seize power on the world's terms. He didn't ascend by force, but he ascended by surrender. And he didn't crush his enemies, but he wept over them. And he didn't grasp at the crown of glory, but he carried the cross of suffering. And because of his obedience here, God highly exalted him. David's grief and boldness points forward to the one who would honor his father perfectly and who would redeem the brokenness that David himself could only mourn over. And so as you sit with this story, just ask yourself, do I need to slow down and grieve rather than grasp? Where am I trying to force open a door that God hasn't yet unlocked? Or what would it look like for me to wait well, to trust that God's timing is not only good, but it is best? So let the story of David here and the foreshadow of Christ shape not how we think, but how we live. And that waiting on God is not a passive thing we do. It's worship, it's active, it's the posture of a heart that says, Lord, I will not take what is not mine. I will not celebrate what you mourn, and I will not move until you say go. And that's the kind of heart that doesn't just survive this waiting period, but it thrives in it, and it's shaped by it. And in the waiting, we become more like Christ, and we get to see that reflection play out. So let's pray. God, I just thank you for all you do for us. Lord, just give us hearts that reflect David, that mourn what is broken and honor what you have appointed, and wait for you in all that you have promised, God. Teach us to just trust you when we're tempted to take control of the situation. Teach us to follow Jesus, our